Appeals, with a test vote likely. Off the floor, the nominee will meet today with several Democratic senators, including Majority Leader Harry Reid. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will read communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 18, 2011. To the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Kirsten E. Gillibrand, a senator from the state of New York, to perform the duties of the chair. Son Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Following any leader remarks, the Senate will be in morning business until 10:30 this morning. 10:30, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-953. There will be 4 hours of debate. At approximately 2:30, there will be a roll call vote on the motion to proceed to that legislation with the 60-vote threshold. I vowed closure last night on the nomination of Goodwin Liu, the United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit. Closure vote on his nomination will be tomorrow.
Madam President.
Republican Leader.
Madam President, last night, Senate Democrats put forth a plan to raise taxes on American energy that, in their words, would have done nothing to lower the price of gas at the pump. As the chairman of the Finance Committee put it, that's not the issue. Well, I think for most Americans, high gas prices actually is the issue. According to a Gallup poll that came out this week, nearly 7 out of 10 Americans say the high cost of gas at the pump is causing financial hardship for their families. More than half of Americans say they've made major changes to compensate for it. And more than 1 in 5 say high gas prices are jeopardizing their standard of living. Americans are struggling. My constituents in Kentucky are hurting, and they want relief. And all they're getting from Democrats in Washington is a dog and pony show. Their own members admit their legislative proposals are gimmicks. They spent a week vilifying the energy industry and another week trying to punish them. The legislation they proposed yesterday would have done 3 things: destroy jobs, send American jobs overseas, and make us more dependent on foreign sources of oil. That's what yesterday's bill would have done. And Democrats themselves admit it wouldn't lower gas prices by a penny. So it's a fair question, what in the world are they doing? Once again, Democrats have been faced with a crisis and done their best to turn it into a political exercise rather than doing something to actually help people and create jobs. They pushed a tax on energy because evidently some of their leaders think it polls well. Well, so does Mother's Day. I would suggest that Democrats spend a little more time looking at the price of gas at their local gas stations than at the latest polling numbers about class warfare rhetoric. At a time when Americans are genuinely struggling out there, at a time when Americans are generally struggling out there, the Democrats have chosen to waste 2 weeks making a political statement rather than in trying to make a difference. Now, the American people, Madam President, deserve a lot better than that. And that's why Republicans have offered the Offshore Production and Safety Act of 2011, which we'll vote on later today. Our plan has basically 3 objectives. First, to restore American offshore production. Second, to improve safety. Third, to require bureaucrats in Washington to get to work on the permitting process to make a decision one way or the other. And it would have 3 corresponding effects. First, and most importantly, our plan would help reduce the price of gas at the pump. By unlocking our own domestic resources and speeding up the permitting process, our plan would actually do something to increase supply, putting downward pressure on price. As the Democratic senator from Missouri said yesterday, the more supply, the less the price. It would also help alleviate our dependence on foreign sources of oil. And it would create thousands of energy jobs right here in America instead of sending them overseas, which is why this bill has the support of both the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I've indicated what our bill does in general. Here are the specifics. In order to restore American offshore production, our plan directs the Secretary of Interior to conduct previously scheduled offshore lease sales in the western and central Gulf of Mexico, Virginia, and Alaska. In addition, the plan will extend lease terms by 1 year for Gulf leases, which were suspended under the 2010 Obama moratorium. After the devastating oil spill we had last year in the Gulf, improving safety is one of our highest priorities. That's why our bill amends the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to require all lessees to develop spill response and containment plans, establish a public-private task force on oil spill response and mitigation, and orders a study on federal response to oil spills by the Comptroller General to examine capabilities and legal authorities related to spill prevention and response to clarify appropriate federal roles. Finally, it is imperative we put in place a process that makes bureaucrats operate more efficiently on the crucial issuance of permits. That's why our plan puts time limits on the review of and decision on drilling permits, providing for 30 days of application review with 2 opportunities for the Interior Department to extend the time period. Beyond that, it provides for a default approval if Interior doesn't reject the application within 60 days. And it directs the Interior Department to provide rationale for rejection of permits. This bill isn't our last on this crisis. We could do a lot more to increase production here at home, and we should. But it offers solutions. And every provision in this bill has bipartisan support. At a time of near-record gas prices, this is a modest approach, a good first step that takes everyone's concerns into account so that we can actually achieve a practical result. That's what Americans want. It's time to stop pointing fingers. It's time to stop picking winners and losers. It's time to stop telling Americans what's best for them. It's time to stop holding Americans back with moratoriums, fees, bureaucratic roadblocks, and the ever-expanding reach of a president who seems to think that business owners in the country need to get his permission first if they want to create jobs. Every single American is feeling the pain at the pump, Democrats and Republicans alike. It's time for the 2 parties to come together and get serious about results. I urge all of my colleagues to support the Offshore Production and Safety Act of 2011. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for debate only until 10:30 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or their designees. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise this morning to commemorate National Police Week and to speak to the service of the brave men and women in local law enforcement. But first, I feel compelled to make a comment in response to the exchange between the Majority Leader and the Republican Leader, and to simply speak, if I could, briefly, about the ongoing pain that each and every working American family feels when they go to the gas station, with the price of gasoline at an all-time high, with the price of gasoline flirting with $4 a gallon, and with the price of oil retreating from an all-time high, and with, most importantly, oil company profits gushing through the roof and hitting an all-time high. Members of our party, members of this body, came forward yesterday with a bill which got more than 50 votes, but failed to hit the 60 needed in this body to make for cloture, which would have made significant progress on dealing with our deficit. We just heard a comment on the floor that we need to stop picking winners and losers and need to move forward in helping America end its dependence on foreign energy. I couldn't agree more, because the expenditures through our tax code, the billions and billions of dollars in needless expenditures through our tax code that continue to subsidize some of the most wildly profitable corporations in American history, is exactly that, picking winners. And the losers are the American people. When I go home to my state, I know, Madam President, when you go home to your state, I hear people day in and day out say, why can't you do more to help create decent jobs, to deal with the deficit, and more than anything, to stop the oil companies, which are despoiling our natural resources and picking my pocket at the pump. This isn't picking on one particular industry. This is rationally looking at our immense tax expenditures through the code and saying there is a time here for us to stop. We would save literally $21 billion by FY 2021. Over the next decade, $21 billion in deficit reduction. That doesn't solve the problem that we need to come together and address as a body, both parties, both chambers of this great Congress. But it is a significant down payment. I'm from a state where we produce very little in the way of oil or coal or gas, but where we consume a lot of energy, and where we've got lots of opportunities to invest in alternative energy. Investments that would create new jobs, a competitive platform for the United States as we enter this new century, and that could, frankly, help sustain our economy going forward. The votes cast here yesterday to sustain these senseless tax breaks and credits, to help keep afloat the most profitable companies in American history, strike me as doing exactly what we were just urged not to do, picking winners where the average American is, in fact, the loser. So it is my hope that we will continue to look with a sharp and clear eye at the billions of dollars, the more than $35 billion in first quarter profits made by the 5 largest American oil firms. I have nothing against corporations making profits. In fact, that's what helps propel our economy. As we try to recover from this terrible recession, having a profitable private sector is the best way forward to help create jobs and to help grow our economy and help deal with federal revenues. But the spending through our tax code, something that has accumulated on the underside of the American economy over the last decades, has to be stopped. And we have to find ways to plug the holes through which billions in federal potential revenue are leaking. And I frankly think it's time for us to have a sensible national energy policy and continuing to defend decades-old needless tax breaks for major oil companies so that they can engage in manufacturing by extracting oil from the ground, for example, one of the 5 that would have been ended by this bill, is just senseless. So it's my hope that we will reconsider, that as we move forward and try to find a way together to create jobs, to reduce spending and deal with our deficits, that we'll look hard at some of these outdated tax breaks that make it possible for bloated oil companies to make billions of dollars of profits off the working Americans who pay too much at the pump. With that, Madam President, if I might, for a few moments, I just wanted to turn to honoring the service and sacrifice of Americans who serve us as police. From May 15th to May 21st is National Police Week, and Americans all across this country will be recognizing those who serve and have served in police departments and communities from coast to coast. Law enforcement personnel and their families will also be coming together to hold memorials for those who've made the ultimate sacrifice and lost their lives in the line of duty. National Police Week holds special significance to me because for the 6 years that I served as county executive in Newcastle County, Delaware, I was responsible for a police force that worked hard day and night to keep our community safe. And every year in May, I would gather with our law enforcement officers, with the Fraternal Order of Police that so ably represented them, with the families of those who had served, and with the families of the one member of our law enforcement community of the Newcastle County Police who'd been killed in the line of duty. I often would have differences with the Fraternal Order of Police in my 6 years in leadership, but I will tell you, They were great and tireless partners in standing up for the working men and women who kept us safe each and every day. They kept us focused on officer safety, and they kept us focused on providing for them the equipment and the training and the support they so richly deserve. And I'll tell you that each and every week that I would have a tough week, when we had difficult times dealing with local budgets or coming to compromise and making reasonable progress in the county, if I ever for a moment felt sorry for myself as I drove home from the county government center, all I needed to do was to turn on my police radio in my county car and listen to dispatch. There was always something going on. As every patrol car went out, as every squad responded to crises, I was reminded day in and day out of the incredible selfless service of the men and women of local law enforcement all over this country, these dedicated men and women who sacrifice time away from their families to put themselves daily in harm's way. And sadly, too often, it finds them. Since the beginning of 2009, 122 American police officers have lost their lives in service to their local communities. And today I wanted to focus on one, Patrolman Chad Spicer of Georgetown, Delaware. A Georgetown native, Chad attended the Sussex Central High School and graduated from Del Tech in 1999. Following 4 years with our State Department of Corrections, he began service with the police department in Bridgeville and later in the town of Laurel. In 2008, Chad joined the force in his hometown, fulfilling his greatest childhood dream. On September 1, 2009, Chad and his partner, Corporal Sean Brittingham, were in pursuit of a vehicle containing suspects in a robbery. The car abruptly stopped, and before the two officers had a chance to get out, a suspect fired a single gunshot at close range, killing Chad and, in a ricochet, seriously wounding his partner. The suspects were eventually apprehended and have been brought to trial. Patrolman Chad Spicer was only 29 years old when he was murdered doing his job. He's survived by his fiancée, his beautiful young daughter Aubrey, his parents Ruth Ann and Norman, a brother, 2 sisters, a family of fellow officers in Georgetown and across our state of Delaware. His funeral service was one of the most moving experiences I've had in my adult life, as thousands of law enforcement professionals, men and women, family members from literally all across our country gathered to pay tribute to this brave, likable, dedicated young man who gave his life in the protection of our community. Earlier this month, the people of Georgetown, Delaware erected a memorial to Chad and his courage and the sacrifice that he made for all of us. Georgetown Chief of Police Topping noted that everyone in town knew and liked Chad, even those from the roughest part of town, even those who were on the receiving end of his service to our community. Chad died protecting the community where he was born and raised, and losing him to senseless violence like that had a devastating impact on the people of Georgetown and on our whole state. Chad was the first Delaware police officer to die from wounds received in the line of duty since 1993. His loss is a constant reminder that law enforcement officers all over our country live with the daily reality that each time they go out on patrol, every time they report for duty, their lives may be put on the line as they serve their communities and our country. This is why, Madam President, I think it's so important that the federal government continue to strengthen local police departments' capacity through things like the Federal Vest Grant Program that helps local law enforcement purchase bulletproof vests and other critical police supplies. It is so important to me that when law enforcement, federal, state, and local work together, we can succeed in keeping Americans safe. There is always more we can do. This is why the Judiciary Committee will be holding a field hearing later next month, June, in Wilmington, Delaware, to explore ways that we can better improve the collaboration and cooperation between federal and local law enforcement. While we honor our men and women of law enforcement every day and every year, during National Police Week, we celebrate their service and sacrifice and thank them for being forever on watch. Mr. President, in memory of Patrolman Chad Spicer and all the other law enforcement professionals who've made the ultimate sacrifice, I today stand in memory of their service. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that speakers on the Republican side be allocated up to 10 minutes each.
We're in a quorum call.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And then I would ask unanimous consent that speakers on the Republican side be allocated up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President, last Friday the Social Security Trustees Report and the Medicare Trustees Report were both released. They showed that as large as our debt and deficits are now, without tackling these two entitlements, our future debts and deficits will dwarf current levels. In fact, this year alone, Medicare is running a cash flow deficit of more than $32 billion. This is the largest deficit ever for this program. Likewise, Social Security will run a cash flow deficit of $46 billion this year. This requires the Treasury to finance these programs through additional borrowing, adding even more to our deficit. In total, though Social Security faces a $6.5 trillion unfunded liability. The reason for this, according to the report, is the aging of our society. As we live longer and as the size of families has decreased, the number of workers financing benefits has steadily decreased. For example, in 1950, there were 16.5 workers for every Social Security recipient, and life expectancy was 69 years old. By 1960, the number of workers supporting each recipient was just more than half of what it was 10 years before. Now there are fewer than 3 workers for each beneficiary, and by 2040 it will be just over 2. Around the same time, in 2036, Social Security's trust fund will run out of all of the, quote, IOUs that the government has issued to it. After this point, Social Security will be able to pay just over 75% of the current benefits. Now, Madam President, that's an important point, because some say that Social Security doesn't need to be reformed because these benefits are still going to be able to be paid. And I think we have to remind ourselves of how this will work. But you can see the demographic trend here, what's happening in the country. Going back to the 1950s, when you had a life expectancy that was shorter, you had more people paying in, 16.5 for everyone that was drawing out. Now we're looking at 2 or 3 people paying in for every one drawing out. And, of course, the life expectancy now is up to about 78 years average. And then in 2040, as I said earlier, 2 people paying in for every one drawing out. So the crunch is coming. We all know that. We can predict it. We see it coming. And, of course, the expectation is that because the Social Security Trust Fund will be able to pay benefits until sometime in the 2037 time frame, that everything is okay. We don't need to take steps to rectify this situation today. The problem with that, Mr. President, is that the so-called IOUs in the Social Security Trust Fund are just more borrowing. When we get to that year, when we get to the 2036, 2037 time frame, there will only be about 75 cents coming in for every dollar that will have to pay it out. And so you will have people literally who will take a huge cut in benefits, or we would have to undergo a massive tax increase, payroll tax increase, in order to make that up, or dramatically increase the borrowing of the federal government, because in fact those IOUs and the trust funds are not an economic benefit that can be, or an economic asset that can be used to pay a cash benefit. It is simply borrowing. We all know that, and the important date, I think, in my mind at least, is the date at which the amount that we receive coming into the Social Security Trust Fund in the form of payroll taxes no longer exceeds the amount that we are paying out in the form of benefits. That happened this year to the tune of $45 billion. Many of us have committed to preserving these programs for existing retirees and for those who are about to retire soon. If we don't reform Social Security, these cuts of nearly 25% would be instant and automatic, giving retirees no time to make other arrangements. Now, working back from the 2036 date to ensure that the program remains solvent and can pay out benefits to future generations requires us, Madam President, to take action today. We don't have the luxury of time. We can't afford to wait. The sooner we take action, the more time that current generations have to prepare for a realistic level of benefits and not be blindsided when their benefits are dramatically cut. Without reform, Americans age 42 and younger will not see full Social Security benefits when they retire. In addition to the aging population, the rapidly rising cost of health care is placing enormous pressures on the Medicare system. Despite the recently enacted health care reform legislation, health care costs rose by over 7% in 2010 compared to about a 1% increase in all other goods and services in the economy. The Medicare trustees reported that the program has an unfunded liability of nearly $36.8 trillion and that the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be completely insolvent by the year 2024. Medicare spending is expected to rise from 3.6% of our entire economy, of our gross domestic product, in 2010, which is where it is today, to 10.7% in 2085. That means that the amount of money the government spends on health care is going to triple over the next 75 years. Now that, Madam President, unbelievably, is the rosy picture of what will happen. Due to the double counting that occurred in unrealistic savings and targets that were included in the health care reform bill that was passed last year, these numbers are going to be invariably worse if further action isn't taken. And finally, the Medicaid system also faces nearly all the same increasing cost and funding challenges as the Medicare system, while also failing to provide states with the flexibility that they need to provide quality care for beneficiaries. Unfortunately, this administration and the last Congress made these problems even worse. Instead of reforming these entitlement programs, they created yet another new entitlement program called the Class Act, which even the Democrat chairman of the Senate Budget Committee has called a Ponzi scheme. Included in the same health care bill passed last year was a massive expansion of Medicaid and the creation of new credits for individuals to buy insurance, all of which add to the budget burdens that we're already experiencing. If these programs are not reformed, we know what we will face. Under the Congressional Budget Office's alternative fiscal scenario, which makes realistic assumptions about the growth of these programs, spending in 2020 would comprise 25.9% of GDP, more than 25% above the historical average. It would continue to grow, and in 2035, spending would comprise 35.2% of GDP, or nearly 60% more than the historical average. In that same year, deficits would comprise nearly 16% of GDP of our entire economy, and debt would be 185% of GDP. Now, I want to illustrate that in the form of a chart here, Madam President, and just show you what this would look like. Historical average for deficits, 3%, as I said. If you look at what we faced in the last 40 to 50 years, roughly, and where that is headed in these out years. Now, if you look at 2010, how this thing has spiked up just in the last couple of years here, we've added massively to the debt, and the stimulus spending, the massive health care entitlement program, all of which are going to make this even worse. But we're on a trend right now, if you draw this out and follow this trajectory, where we will get to where literally the deficit is going to represent 61% of our entire economy. That is a stunning path to be on, Madam President, why it cries out for us to take the steps that are necessary to get our country back on the right fiscal track. Interest on the debt, half of which is paid to foreign debtors, would comprise nearly 9% of our entire economy. Now, what's interesting about interest on the debt, because we all talk about the impact of carrying this amount of debt, and today we have so much debt that in a few years, the amount that we pay for interest will exceed the amount that we spend on national security. In other words, we will spend more financing our debt, simply making the interest payments, than we do defending the country. But think about that. Think about where we have gotten to in this country. And think about the fact, too, Madam President, that if we saw even a 1% increase in interest rates, if interest rates went up 1%, and we had to pay more to borrow money from those creditors, some of which are foreign countries, it would increase the interest that we pay annually by $140 billion. That is how sensitive we are to a slight increase in interest rates because of this massive amount of debt. We just passed yesterday, the day before, the $14.3 trillion level, the debt limit. We're going to have to raise the debt limit here. We don't know exactly when, sometime in July, sometime perhaps in August, but in any event, that's coming. We've maxed out our credit card, our borrowing authority we've hit the limit on that, and in order to keep the government functioning, we're going to have to increase the amount that our country borrows. And if we followed the President's budget, we would double that in the next decade. We'll go from $14.3 trillion literally to almost over $26 trillion in the next decade under the President's budget. Why? Because the President didn't make any attempt in his budget to reduce spending or to reform these entitlement programs to which I just referred. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the big drivers of federal spending. And if we don't take steps to reform those entitlement programs, this picture gets worse and worse over time. And I just want to illustrate that with one last chart, Madam President. This is where we are today, and this is debt as a share of our economy, which, as I said before, if you look at historical averages, what we've carried in the form of debt, in World War II, obviously there was a big ramp up because we had to finance the war, and then coming out of the war as the economy started to expand and we got spending under control, we got the debt as a percentage of our entire economy started to come down to more of a historical average, which is where it stayed literally for about 40 to 50 years. But then again, it started to spike here, starts to spike in the last couple of years as we've seen spending increase. And the reason for that is because the amount that we spend as a percentage of our total economy has continued to tick up. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're looking at, what was the number here, 25.9% of GDP is what we will spend on the federal government in 2020, according to the Congressional Budget Office's alternative fiscal scenario. If you think about that, the amount that we spent historically as a percent of our economy on the federal government has been 20.6%. That's been the 40-year average. So we are going from 20.6% 40-year average spending as a percent of our entire economy. That's the amount that government constitutes, federal government at least, of what our entire economic output is, to 25.9% a decade from now. So federal spending continues to spike up. And when it does, because we're having to finance so much of our spending with borrowing, the borrowing level increases dramatically to the point where we're looking at debt to GDP on this path right here. If we don't take steps to change it, this is what we're looking at. It is a straight-up spike in the amount of borrowing to GDP. And pointed out, I guess I would say, too, by where we are currently. Right now, we're running, somewhere in the $1.4, $1.6 trillion annual deficits on $3.8 trillion in total spending, which means that out of every dollar that the federal government is spending, we are borrowing over 40 cents. Now, can you imagine any family or business in this country that could continue to get by borrowing literally over 40 cents out of every dollar that they spend? You can't do it. That would be like the average family in this country having an annual income of about $60,000 and spending $110,000. You can't do that. The federal government's been doing it for way too long. And that's why we have to take on this issue of spending and debt. Now, some people would argue that we don't have enough revenues. They'll say that we need to raise taxes, that the way that we deal with this fiscal crisis is to get more revenue coming into the federal government. I would argue, Madam President, based upon these facts, that this is not a revenue problem. This is a spending problem. The reason we are where we are is not because we don't have enough revenue. It's because we are spending dramatically more as a percentage of our entire economy than we have literally for the past 40 to 50 years. If you look at the historical average, 20.6% over the last 40 years is what we have spent on the federal government as a percentage of our entire economic output, our entire economy. And today that's 24%. As I said, by the year 2020, we're looking at over 25%, an increase of 25% in the amount that we are spending on the federal government as a percentage of our entire economy. This is a spending problem. This is not a revenue problem. We need to address it, we need to recognize it, and we need to understand that the only way we can fix it is to deal with what is driving that spending. It is Social Security, it is Medicare, it is Medicaid. Those three programs comprise 55 to 60% of all of government spending. And absent reforms to those programs, this is what we will end up with. This is where we will be as a nation, and that is certainly someplace I don't think most Americans want to go. Now, the other reason it's critically important, and I've said this before on the floor and I'll say it again, that it has implications not only for future generations, but it has implications in the here and now. One of which is, when you are carrying this kind of debt to GDP, sustaining this kind of a debt level, it impacts your economy's ability to create jobs because you're crowding out private investment that otherwise would be allocated to more productive uses, and you're spending it on government. You're also impacting interest rates and inflation in ways that could be counter to the economic expansion and growth and job creation in the country. And there's been a great amount of research and study that's gone into at what level does that really start to take away from economic growth, economic expansion, and job creation. And the two people who recently put a book out on this, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, suggested from their study of countries, mostly developed countries over the last half-century, that when your debt to GDP reaches 90%, it is costing you about 1 percentage point of economic growth every year. Well, in this country, losing 1 percentage point of economic growth costs us about 1 million jobs in our economy. So if we say we're serious about job creation, one of the things that we clearly ought to be focused on is getting spending and debt under control. Because if we sustain and carry this kind of debt level for the foreseeable future, we are going to cost the economy 1 percentage point of economic growth and therefore a significant amount of jobs that otherwise might have been created by that economy. That's one reason we need to rein it in. The other one I'll point out is the statement that's been made repeatedly by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who has said the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to speak for another minute.
Without objection.
And so I would say that the national security implications of this are very real as well. When you have the highest-ranking military official saying that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt, that is a stunning, stunning statement. And I think speaks volumes about why it's important that we get this issue under control. One of the reasons he says that, obviously, is because so much of the debt is held by foreign countries, all of which have additional leverage on us because we owe them so much money. We need to get the spending under control. We need to get the debt dealt with. That starts with entitlement reform, and I hope the discussions that are currently occurring between the White House and some of the leaders here in Congress will come to a result where we can work together and use this as an opportunity to, for once and for all, put this country back on a fiscal track that will ensure that future generations are not burdened and saddled with an enormous amount of debt and an economy that is saddled with the weight and not able to create the jobs to get people back to work and to grow and prosper and create a higher quality of living and a higher standard of living for the next generation. Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that quorum calls be divided equally on both sides.
Without objection.
Of quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
Madam President, today the Senate is going to consider a bill to increase offshore drilling. This is the Republican response to the nation's need for a national energy policy and to rising gasoline prices. I believe the Republican approach to this will be unsuccessful. I believe it overlooks some very fundamental and basic facts. And the facts are these. We cannot drill our way out of our problem. If you take a look at all the known oil reserves in the United States, offshore and onshore, all of them, they comprise 2% of the known oil reserves in the world, 2%. Now take a look at how much oil the United States consumes each year, 25% of the world oil production. So the Republican answer is drill, baby, drill. Honestly, that's not going to solve the problem. And it is going to invite some dangerous activities which we should know better than to engage in. It hasn't been that long ago that 170 million gallons of oil poured out of a well that was improperly drilled by BP in the Gulf of Mexico. The devastation that followed to the local economy and to the environment is virtually incalculable. Have we learned a lesson? A lesson that safety should be the hallmark when it comes to drilling? That we ought to make certain that before we go into an environment that is precious or where an accident could create some unknown hazard or danger, that we thoroughly investigate that in advance? That's not too much to ask. We know what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico today as the economy is still trying to recover. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle who will produce the McConnell approach, the drill, baby, drill approach today, want us to just forget the spill. They want to begin rushing into drilling with the same reckless practices that led to the spill in the first place. This isn't going to solve our problem. In fact, it may create more problems. If passed, the Republican bill would require the Secretary of the Interior to evaluate a permit application in 60 days, regardless of its complexity, 60 days. If the Secretary cannot make a decision within 60 days, the permit is automatically approved, even if it contains potential environmental and safety risks. This kind of arbitrary deadline makes it impossible for regulators to do the in-depth scientific analysis needed to accurately evaluate the risks and safety requirements for every application. The bill also mandates the sale of offshore oil and gas leases in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Virginia, and the Arctic Ocean. Sales that were postponed in order to investigate their potential environmental impact. Not only does the Republican bill not add any new protocols to ensure that increased drilling will be safe, it revokes some of the additional requirements that were instituted following the BP spill. They haven't learned any lesson from what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Essentially, this bill would lead to more offshore drilling with less safety and regulation of the industry. You would think that the BP oil spill never happened if you consider this bill, which will be on the floor later today. And there's really no reason to rush to begin new drilling projects in such an irresponsible manner. Because you see, under President Obama, domestic oil production has grown to its highest level in the last 7 years. That's right. It has grown to its highest level in the last 7 years, and if you listen to the other side, you would think the opposite was true, that we've really cut back or stopped drilling. Since February, 34 permits for 14 unique deepwater wells have been issued under the new safety requirements since the BP spill. Oil production in federal waters has increased in both of the last 2 years. Last weekend, the President announced several steps the administration would take to expand further responsible development of domestic energy resources. The Department of Interior will hold lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska by mid-2012 once additional analyses have been completed. Extensions will be granted to all leases offered by the Deepwater Suspension as well as delayed leases in Alaska. Annual oil and gas lease sales will be held on Alaska's National Petroleum Reserve, and the Mid- and South Atlantic coast will undergo an expedited review for fuel resources. The President's actions show that we are continuing to expand our domestic resources responsibly. This careless Republican bill is unnecessary. It's bad policy. It's been proposed by Senator McConnell, and it would force us to disregard all the lessons we learned from the tragic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a year ago. Madam President, it's been many years back that I was up in Alaska when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in the Prince William Sound and dumped tens of thousands of barrels of crude oil into this beautiful, beautiful place in our world. I was up there, and we had workers out, and they were literally swabbing up the oil off of the rocks as it washed up on the shore. They wore these yellow slickers, which in no time at all were covered with this black crude oil. And the cameras were running around taking photos of the workers. And I went over to an old fella in one of these yellow slickers who had these big swaddling claws mopping up this crude oil that had been dumped by the barrel into this beautiful, beautiful place at Prince William Sound. And I said to him after the cameras left, "Do you think this is helping?" And he says, "Well," he says, "I think if we didn't do anything, God would take care of this in about 10 years. But by putting in extra effort, maybe it'll be 9 years and 6 months." The point I'm making is this. Once the spill has taken place, it takes time. Time for nature to restore itself if it can. In Prince William Sound, some species of fish never returned. I don't know what will happen in the Gulf of Mexico. Perhaps over time nature will heal this wound. I hope it does. Don't we have a special responsibility as stewards of this planet, of this earth, of this nation, to be careful? Is it too much to ask that we engage in fuel efficiency and thoughtful energy policy rather than recklessly drill in every direction without asking the hard questions, without taking the time for an honest analysis? Not only did the BP oil spill despoil that area, it claimed human lives. When it comes to safety and environmental responsibility, we shouldn't be cutting corners like the Republican bill would do. And at the end of the day, even if they could drill every place they wanted to drill with no questions asked, it would have virtually no impact on gasoline prices. Oil prices are set on a global market, and we can't change them simply by attempting to increase oil production when it comes to only 2% of the known global reserves. Given the President's recent action and our steady increase in domestic production, this bill is pointless and dangerous. For this reason, I urge my colleagues not to support it, to vote against this measure that will be offered later today. And I ask consent at this point to speak on a different topic and that it be placed at a separate place in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Madam President, it was last February that I went to Belarus. I had been invited to go to Lithuania to speak to the Parliament on the 20th anniversary of their independence from the Soviet Union, and took a separate trip into Minsk, Belarus, in a neighboring nation, because there was a political crisis. It was February, and since the presidential election in the December before, there had been a wholesale effort by Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, to imprison his political opponents. With so many significant events going on in the Middle East, there's an understandable risk that we lose sight of things happening in countries like Belarus. In Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, if you have the temerity to run for president or protest a fraudulent election, you'll find yourself thrown in a KGB jail, where you're likely going to face torture and harsh prison sentences. If this sounds like a throwback to the Cold War and the Soviet Union, that's exactly what it is. Madam President, I ask the Senate be brought to order. Not only is Belarus a throwback to the worst political abuses of the old Soviet era, but the government's enforcers of this bankrupt system still call their police the KGB. On Saturday, the Lukashenko regime continued its nightmare of totalitarian rule when it convicted one of the country's opposition presidential candidates and former foreign minister, Andrew Sanikov, to 5 years in prison. You see, Mr. Sanikov had the temerity to run against the dictator of Europe, Lukashenko. And because of that, even having lost the election, he's going to pay for it by spending 5 years in prison. This picture here, this photograph, shows Mr. Sanikov in the defendant's cage during his trial in the Belarusian capital of Minsk. They put him in a cage. Can anyone think of a more telling symbol of Lukashenko's tyranny than a sham court proceeding with a KGB cage? His crime, this man ran for president of his country. In December last year, after nearly 2 decades of unchecked power, Lukashenko decided he'd have an open election. In his words, an open election. Many took him at his word and decided they'd run for president. Apparently, Lukashenko didn't care for that idea. His idea of election is no one runs against you. So he staged a sham election and then arrested 5 of the 6 presidential candidates and more than 600 peaceful demonstrators after the election. I visited Belarus some weeks afterwards, met with the family members of these brave candidates and activists, and I've got to tell you, it was a moving experience. The meetings included members of Mr. Sanikov's family. This was a photo which we took in the office of the U.S. consulate in Minsk in Belarus. It shows Konstantin Sanikov, Ali Sanikova, and Luciano Kalip. Konstantin and Alla are Mr. Sanikov's son and mother. Alla told me in tears that her son's arrest led to no contact between him and his family for weeks, and they denied him a lawyer. After he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, she told Radio Liberty she was proud of her son, that he'd, quote, suffered so much for the sake of Belarus. The judicial system has steamrolled our family, she said. Lucina is the grandmother of the candidate's 3-year-old son, Daniel. I wanted to put this photo up because Lukashenko decided it wasn't enough to throw this boy's father into prison. He basically said that they were going to remove this boy from the family as part of the punishment they were going to impose on him for running for president in that country. You see, not only did they arrest Sanikov, but they arrested his wife, too. She was a journalist and therefore automatically suspect in Belarus. Even more despicably, they tried to take custody of this little boy who was staying with his grandmother. Now, what kind of cruel mind is so afraid of free expression of ideas that they would go after this little boy to further punish the parents, the father who had the nerve to run for president, the mother who had the nerve to publish in some underground publication any article critical of Lukashenko? President Lukashenko's repression and totalitarian regime have been condemned around the world. Asset freezes and travel bans have been placed on his enablers and police state enforcers. This Senate and the European Parliament both have passed sweeping resolutions condemning the regime, calling for new legitimate elections and release of all political prisoners. And the families of the detained, the Senate, the European Parliament, and the National Hockey League Hall of Famer Pete Stastny have called on the International Ice Hockey Federation to suspend its Belarus-hosted 2014 Ice Hockey Championship until all political prisoners are unconditionally released. A dictator such as Lukashenko should not be rewarded the international prestige of an event while prisoners languish in prison for simply exercising their human rights. I think it's time for the International Criminal Court prosecutor to look into Lukashenko's regime, most notably for the allegations of torture. I'm going to conclude by simply saying I want Mr. Sanikov and his many brave colleagues in Belarus and their families to know that the United States will stand by them in their effort to bring a peaceful democracy to this great nation of Belarus. We commend their bravery and let them know that they are not forgotten. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-953, which the clerk will report. Under the previous order,
Motion to proceed to the consideration of S. 953, a bill to authorize the conduct of certain lease sales in the Outer Continental Shelf to amend the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to modify the requirements for exploration and for other purposes.
Madam President.
Under the previous order, there will be 4 hours of debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees. Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, we've been debating tax subsidies to the 5 big oil companies. We've limited it to just the 5 big oil companies, even though many of the tax breaks or tax credits or deductions they receive are the same tax credits that every other big company receives: Starbucks, Microsoft, Caterpillar, Google, Hollywood film producers, and many of the other credits look a lot like the R&D tax credit or other tax credits that all American businesses receive. Well, I'm one senator who's very intrigued with the idea of looking at all of the tax breaks in the tax code. They're about $1.2 trillion a year that we spend on, we call them tax expenditures, and we spend them on tax breaks that we think are desirable. I'm ready to look at all of them and use the money to reduce the tax rate and or reduce the federal debt. But if we're going to talk about reduce the federal debt, but if we're going to talk about energy subsidies, tax subsidies, we ought to talk about all energy subsidies. Senator John Cornyn of Texas has asked the Congressional Research Service to do just this. It's an excellent study, and I commend Senator Cornyn for asking for it. This is some of what it finds. According to the report, fossil fuels contribute about 78% of our energy production in 2009 and received about 13% of the federal tax support for energy. However, during that same time, 10.6% of our energy production was from renewables, and 77.4% of our energy tax subsidies went to renewables. So we are to compare the subsidy per unit of energy. Estimated federal support per million BTU of fossil fuels was 4 cents, while support for renewable was $1.97 per million BTU. So federal subsidies for renewables were almost 50 times as great per unit of energy as federal subsidies for fossil fuels. And this would be distorted because included within renewables is hydroelectric power. Most people think of renewables as ethanol or solar or wind. So at least 50 times as great per unit of energy is the federal taxpayer support for renewable energy compared with fossil fuel energy. So why aren't we including in our debate subsidies for all renewables? Specifically, if we're talking about big oil, why don't we talk about big wind? The Senate seems an appropriate place to talk about big wind. The Energy Policy Act of 1992 created what's called the production tax credit for energy produced using renewable resources. Most of this money has gone to subsidize big wind. It's a policy that was supposed to last a few years. It's lasted 2 decades. Today, the production tax credit for wind gives 2.1 cents for every kilowatt hour of wind electricity produced by a wind turbine during the first 10 years of operation. Let's put this into a context that's current. The new Shepherd's Flat wind farm in Oregon will have 338 of these huge wind turbines, produce enough power to run approximately 250,000 homes, and will cost the American taxpayer about $57 million a year in subsidies for that electricity produced. If we allocated the tax credit per home, taxpayers will be paying $2,300 over the next 10 years for each of the homes served by the Shepherd's Flat wind farm in Oregon. This doesn't even take into account the fact that $1.3 billion in federal loan guarantees to this project means that big wind will have its risk of default also financed by the taxpayer. Fossil fuel companies don't have that advantage. Nuclear power companies
don't have that advantage, even though their electricity is completely clean. No sulfur, no nitrogen, no mercury, no carbon. If the wind farm in Oregon had to pay the risk of default up front as a fee, it would cost another $130 million. That's money out of the pockets of taxpayers. The total cost of the wind production tax credit over the next 10 years will cost the American taxpayers more than $26 billion. Let me say that again. American taxpayers are subsidizing big wind over the next 10 years by more than $26 billion. In fact, the tax breaks for the 5 big oil companies that we've been debating on the floor this week actually cost less than all of the money that we give to big wind. The tax breaks for the big oil companies amount to about $21 billion over 10 years. According to the Energy Information Administration in 2007, big wind receives a $18.82 subsidy per megawatt hour, 25 times as much per megawatt hour as subsidies for all other forms of electricity combined. But wind is about the least efficient means of energy production we have. It accounts for just about 2% of our electricity. It's available only when the wind blows, which is about a third of the time. The Tennessee Valley Authority says it is reliable even less than that, meaning you can have it when you need it. Wind farms take up a huge amount of space. Turbines are 50 stories high. Their flashing lights can be seen for 20 miles. An unbroken line of turbines along the 2,100-mile Appalachian Highway would produce no more electricity than 4 nuclear reactors on 4 square miles of land. Wind is generally strongest, and land is available where the electricity isn't needed. So we have thousands of miles of new transmission lines proposed to get the energy from where it's produced to where it needs to go. Those often go through conservation areas. According to the National Academy of Sciences, wind power is more expensive than other forms of electricity, such as coal, nuclear, biomass, geothermal, natural gas. We haven't even talked about the fact that these farms only last about 20 years. The question is, who's going to take them down? Wind farms kill a lot of birds, according to the American Bird Conservancy. They can interfere with radar systems. Many who live near them say they're very noisy. So I ask the question, if wind has all these drawbacks, is a mature technology, and receives subsidies greater than any other form of energy per unit of actual energy produced, why are we subsidizing it with billions of dollars and not including it in this debate? Why are we talking about big oil and not talking about big wind? I believe there are appropriate uses of temporary incentives and subsidies to help jumpstart innovation and the development of new technology, such as jumpstarting electric cars or natural gas fleets of trucks or loan guarantees for nuclear power plants, as long as these are short-term. I believe research and development is an appropriate role for the federal government, whether it's in recycling used nuclear fuel or finding alternative biofuels made from crops we don't eat. I believe it's entirely appropriate for there to be research for offshore wind farms, which we don't know as much about and which might actually prove to be a useful supplement in the Northeast. But my point is, if we're going to debate subsidies to big oil, we ought to be debating all the energy subsidies, including those to big wind. There's a difference between the Republican and the Democratic plan for $4 gasoline and high energy prices. The Democratic plan basically wants their cure for high prices is to raise the prices. They want to tax energy more. That makes energy cost more. Republicans want to find more American energy and use less American energy. You might sum it up this way. Republicans want to find more and use less. Democrats want to find less and tax more. The Democratic plan, according to Senator Schumer of New York, was never intended to talk about lowering gas prices. Senator Reid agreed, Senator Baucus agreed, Senator Landrieu agreed, Senator Begich agreed. Well, why aren't we talking about trying to find a way to lower gasoline prices when they're $4 a gallon and going up? The Republican plan is very specific. Find more American oil and more American natural gas. You find that offshore, where 30% of our oil and 25% of our natural gas is produced. You find it on federal lands, and you find it in Alaska. And then the other part of our equation is use less. We have some agreement with the Obama administration on some of these ideas. There are a number of them. Jumpstart electric cars. Senator Merkley and I have a bill that is before the Energy Committee tomorrow to do that. I believe electrifying our cars and trucks is the single best way to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. There's legislation to jumpstart natural gas for trucks, biofuels from crops we don't eat, fuel efficiency. All these are various ways to use less. Senator Thune and Senator Barrasso have performed a service by setting straight the record to show that the United States produces a lot of oil. We're actually the third largest oil producer in the world. So I ask this question: if less Libyan oil helps raise gasoline prices, which it did, then more American oil should help lower gasoline prices. At least for every dollar of American oil we drill, it's one less dollar that we send overseas. So, Madam President, the Republican plan is to find more American oil and natural gas and to use less. And my suggestion is, if we're going to be talking about tax subsidies for big oil, let's talk about tax subsidies for all energy. The Senate floor seems an especially appropriate place, if we're going to talk about big oil, also to talk about tax subsidies for big wind. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. And notice the